So generate an altruistic motivation for the meditation. And reflect how there is a great need to purify negativities. Purification is a way to overcome suffering. We have doubts, but if we can understand it on a deeper level, that will lead to an inner transformation. So where does our happiness come from? It comes from our physical aggregate, our body, such as cold, hunger, illness, and also from our mental aggregate, the suffering of frustration or desire, all our mental unhappiness. And the same for our happiness, our feelings of comfort and mental ease and pleasure. So reflect how our body is composed of 4 elements. When they're not in harmony, we experience suffering. We use clothing and a good diet. We earn money to have good housing and protect ourselves from the elements. Our parents, teachers, and society teach us how to overcome the various sufferings that arise, particularly on the physical level, the sufferings of our body. Some efforts are made these days, but in society, most of the research is given to counter physical suffering. Buddha Dharma, however, focused mainly on mental suffering, but also physical suffering, aiming to overcome both of these. And it's only in the Buddha Dharma that we have the ability to completely eliminate suffering altogether. Society does have many good methods to avert physical suffering. And we get great help from easing that suffering. However, they're only temporary. And easing the physical suffering doesn't help our mental disturbances, our mental well-being. Even a person who is very well off with good health and good resources, power and influence, may suffer mentally. They have very high expectations of their entitlement and also can suffer from fear of loss of their privilege. All of us have a wish to be free of both mental and physical suffering and pain. And it's the mental suffering that causes us the most pain. When great fear arises, you're not necessarily aware of any physical pain you may be in. And if one has trained one's mind very well, then physical hardships don't disturb one's mental well-being. The cultivation of mental happiness has the ability to overcome physical suffering due to the control one has over the mental and physical aggregates, especially if one is able to attain calm abiding, which comes from training the mind. So there's a great need to direct our efforts into controlling our own mind as a way to overcome both mental and physical pain and suffering. Examine in your own life if your wealth or good looks or the comfort around you is able to help when your mind is feeling low, feeling down. We expect that we can gain happiness through controlling our external world. But happiness can only come by controlling our inner world. Reflect on the ability of loving kindness and compassion and patience to overcome the various difficulties that arise. Shakyamuni Buddha did not focus on science or engineering. He emphasized that we need to change our way of thinking. And he did not rely on the accumulation of knowledge alone. He investigated his own experience and meditated and gained direct experience of that knowledge. We too need to gain direct experience of the Dharma that we hear and reflect on. If we practice in that way, we will come to know that we'll come to know on what causes happiness depends on, and on what causes suffering depends on. Shakyamuni Buddha practiced in that way, becoming certain about the Dharma, and we need to do the same. So the root of all happiness and all suffering comes from our mind. The Buddha Dharma focuses on mental development. So reflect how all objects of the senses, things we hear, taste, touch, etc., as well as our bodies, our mind, are impermanent. They're momentary. So they depend on causes and conditions to come about. The same is true for the feeling of happiness and the feeling of suffering. They are impermanent and come about in dependence on causes and conditions. So think about illness that arises in one's body. Or the suffering of heat or cold, our physical suffering. It depends on our body, but does it depend on our mind? If we didn't have a body, would we suffer from illness or heat or cold? Our body of this life came through conception in our mother's womb, which depended on our parents sleeping together, which depended on attachment. For that conception to take place, there was also a need for our own contaminated karma to ripen for a human rebirth. So the cause of our conception is from our parents' attachment and from our own contaminated virtue. The root cause is the ignorance, in particular the ignorance of self-grasping. Just as everything within samsara comes from the root cause of the ignorance of self-grasping. Samsara arises from contaminated karma and afflictions. It's from that main cause that all the physical suffering associated with our body comes about. This is our situation when we get sick. We suffer and we may get well, or we may not. The cause for rebirth for an Arya Bodhisattva is quite different. Their rebirth, their conception comes about through pure virtue and prayer. So they don't suffer from heat or cold or illness. Their physical aggregate is completely different. It's uncontaminated. So the contaminated aggregate, our own body, is the basis of the physical suffering we experience and depends on afflictions. This is why the mind is primary. The cause of happiness and suffering is primarily the mind, because virtue leads to happiness and non-virtue leads to suffering. The motivating mind itself determines what brings happiness and what brings suffering. So then what is the nature or entity of non-virtue, and where is it to be found? Shakyamuni Buddha taught that if an action results in happiness, it is virtuous. If it results in suffering, then it is non-virtuous. So anger is non-virtuous. It's a wish to harm, and it leads to suffering and must be abandoned. It gives rise to a disturbed mind, and it results in rebirth in lower realm. Patience, on the other hand, is a virtue because it leads to happiness and a good rebirth. So it needs to be cultivated. So virtue and non-virtue are found on our mental continuum. It's with that conviction that we understand the non-virtues need to be purified from our continuum. Reflecting in this way, we can see how important it is to concentrate on our inner world and to put effort into cultivating the causes of happiness and eliminating the causes of suffering. When we experience difficulties, we should be reminded of this. To reflect in more detail, take for example the experience of suffering from cold. It's not the temperature that is causing us the suffering, it's the feeling within the mind of suffering. Feeling has three types: pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And Buddha taught the three types of suffering that we need to understand. The first refers to the feeling of suffering, the feeling of mental or physical pain or discomfort. The second type is the suffering of transitory change. When we're suffering from cold, if we experience the warmth of a heater, then it's a condition for happiness to then arise. That's a transitory pleasure, or the suffering of change. The suffering of being too cold has reduced. The beings in the world mainly strive for this type of happiness, but it's transitory, it doesn't last. In time, we'll get too hot. And getting too hot itself is further suffering. So it's called the suffering of transitory pleasure, or the suffering of change. The third type of suffering is pervasive suffering, or the pervasive suffering of conditioning. Having a contaminated body and mind. The suffering of change and all pervasive suffering are not accepted by the world as needing to be eliminated. Normally, worldly beings only try to get rid of the first type of suffering. But the feeling of suffering, of being cold, is a feeling of suffering. It's not the temperature. Not everyone experiences the same temperature in the same way. While the seeds of suffering exist on our mental continuum, we have the potential to experience suffering. If we remove those seeds, we don't have the potential to experience that suffering. So we need to put all our attention, all our focus, our efforts in purifying those negative karmic seeds on our continuum. Shakyamuni Buddha taught us how to transform our inner world. How to tip the scales, becoming more habituated with virtue, so that our habits of non-virtue become weaker and less. The causes of suffering are consciousness, not the material things. They can be eliminated by cultivating the contrary consciousnesses. And that depends on our efforts. Hearing the teachings, reflecting on them, and familiarizing with them through meditation. By doing this again and again, we can transform our own minds. The seeds of suffering depend on causes and conditions. So it is within our control to eliminate those causes. So to conclude, just dedicate any positive potential from the meditation towards quickly attaining enlightenment to be of greatest benefit to each and every living being.